Okay, so we'll bring everybody up to speed, yeah. So we're in the middle of reading Moshe Feinstein, Igros Moshe, addressing the question of elective cosmetic surgery. So we already learned the perspective of Rabbi Waldenberg and the Tzitz Eliezer, and he essentially comes from the question of medicine in general and the use of medicine as a whole and doctors practicing as a whole. And he says, from Torah's perspective, healing comes from God, and God grants permission to the doctor to heal, and anything outside of the scope of that permission is not for the doctor to do, and thus, because there's no healing involved in elective cosmetic surgery, he forbids it. That was Rabbi Waldenberg. Rabbi Feinstein comes from a different perspective and begins with the question of harming oneself. One is not allowed to inflict injury upon oneself. And essentially began with the view of Tosfos, which clearly states that even if by inflicting harm upon oneself one gains something out of it, nonetheless it's still forbidden. Right? He distinguished between the oil in the head. He distinguished between the taking on of pain in exchange for a gain versus the withholding of pleasure, like let's say a diet, where a person's not taking on pain, you're just withholding one pleasure for the sake of a greater pleasure, and that he said is definitely okay, right? But Tosfos says even if there's a gain, meaning if you're actually taking upon yourself pain, in the case of the surgery would be cutting yourself, God forbid, right? The person's cutting themselves in surgery, that would be forbidden even though there's a gain to be had in Tosfos' view. But then he said the Rambam's view is that the entire prohibition to hit someone else and oneself is derech bizoyon, or in another version of Rambam, derech nitzoyon, either in strife or in a shameful manner. And therefore, if the hitting, as it were, if the striking, if the harming oneself has a gain, it's permitted. And the classic example would be cosmetic surgery, where a person's inflicting a wound upon oneself, but it's for a gain, to look better, and thus it's permitted. This is Rabbi Feinstein ruling in accord with Rambam. Now the last thing we left off with was the Gemara in Sanhedrin.
I'm saying Tosfos really holds that operation is not good.
It would seem from Tosfos that one cannot inflict a wound upon one's. Oh, well, if it's medical, then it's fine. If it's medical, it's fine. Yeah, if it's medical, no, elective cosmetic surgery is not medical, right? So if it's medical, definitely permissible. But if it's not, if there's no medical gain, it's just a personal gain in exchange for wounding oneself, Tosfos would say it's still forbidden. Whereas Rabbi Feinstein understands Rambam to be of the view that if there is something to be gained out of the wound you inflict upon yourself, it's permitted. And over here, there is something to be gained. Better looks. That's essentially what he argues. So let's go to the pages Reish Tzadik Aleph there. We're skipping around a little bit in the letter, but we'll go to the next section. Because I also want to cover the piece from the Alter Rebbe and the piece from the Rebbe and from Rabbi Zevin. And I want to finish that tonight so we don't have to revisit the subject. This is already our fourth class on the subject. We've been on it for quite a while. So on page Reish Tzadik Zayin on the bottom right, where there's the square brackets there that I penciled in. Yeah. And therefore it seemed to me, says Rabbi Feinstein, we should permit lahanaira for this young girl, liyafetz atzma, to beautify herself. Even though this comes through inflicting a wound upon herself, she's going through a surgery, so there's a wound to be had. But nonetheless, because this wound is not in a manner of strife or shame, Ella Adar, by the contrary, it's for her own benefit that she gets to look better. Now, the Ayin b'Sanhedrin daf Peidalad Amud Beis, see the Gemara in Sanhedrin, page 84b, which we referenced to in the previous class, and I just noted it a moment ago, where there the Gemara says, Rav Masna Amar, Rav Masna says, Sheben muter lahakes dam la'aviv, that a child, a son, may bloodlet their father. I mentioned this before. It was an ancient form of healing, a medical procedure called bloodletting, which essentially was they let the blood run out of the body, and they let the body reproduce new blood, and the new blood is supposedly healthier than the old one. This was a thing people used to do back in the day. It seems from the Gemara that people had it scheduled, like twice a year, once a year, whatever it is, they would do it. Certainly I think even when people ran fevers, they used to do it. I don't know when this practice stopped, but this is a practice that existed. So the Gemara says that a son may do that to the father because there's a medical gain. And you'll remember when we looked at Gemara, there was two opinions as to why it's permitted. Right? One opinion was that really you shouldn't, but he derived from a verse which compared the hitting of an animal to the hitting of a human. And just like when it comes to the hitting of an animal, you're allowed to if there's a medical gain. So too with the hitting of a human, you're allowed to if there's medical gain. Hitting someone meaning injuring someone, and thus you may bloodlet. And Rav Masna said, no, the reason why you're allowed to bloodlet is because of ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your fellow as yourself. Which means it's an injunction, go ahead and bloodlet, not just permission. But go ahead and do it because you love your fellow as yourself. And you would want a medical procedure done for your benefit, so go ahead and do it to another. And even a son to a child, even though the prohibition for a son to hit their parent is more strict, as we learned, is even more strict than hitting someone else. The punishment is capital punishment rather than just a regular prohibition, as well as we also discussed that when it comes to hitting a fellow, the issue is injury. Hitting with parents, even the hitting without injury. We talked about different
differences.
differences.
What was the answer to that? I forgot why you're allowed to with the parent.
So the Gemara gives two reasons. The Gemara says either because love your fellow as yourself, because there's medical gain, or because of the comparison to the two psukim comparing Makkah Behema to Makkah Ish.
I know, but that's a regular person. The parent needs more than that. Because parent is the Seres Adibris. It's a different thing. I think that is enough.
It's not in the Seres Adibris, but
because it's Kibbutz Avim.
Right, but Makkah Avim is a different part. Is somewhere else. A different prohibition. Yeah. Anyway, but this is what the Gemara says. So let's see. So there the Gemara says that Rav Masna says the reason why a son is allowed to bloodlet his father or his parent, Mishum Shenem, because the verse reads, love your fellow as yourself. Now, Pirish Rashi explains in commenting on this Gemara to explain what Rav Masna means by citing this pasuk, love your fellow as yourself. So what Rashi does is something interesting. One could have argued from the Gemara itself that what the Gemara is doing by citing the verse which says love your fellow as yourself is the Gemara is citing to a mitzvah which overrides a prohibition. If Torah says don't do something, but then elsewhere Torah says do something, and the do something contradicts the don't do, then you go ahead with the do. Right? It's a lav and an asay, and the asay overrides. So you might have argued, okay, so love your fellow as yourself overrides the prohibition. But here's what Rashi comments. He says like this. He doesn't say that. He says, the prohibition that Jews are prevented from doing things to their friends, it's only something that one does not want done to himself. In other words, he's not saying love your fellow overrides the prohibition of hitting. But the prohibition of hitting doesn't apply here because the hitting is only to do some sort of hitting that's inappropriate because you wouldn't want it to happen to yourself. But if the hitting is something you do want, medical procedure, then go ahead and do it. And he explains.
That's like
Precisely, exactly right. Exactly right. So it's not a positive commandment overriding a negative. It's just reframing the negative commandment. The negative commandment which says down that shall not hit your friend does not apply here. It's not being overrided here. And that's why you're allowed to do it to your father because the whole thing doesn't apply. The hitting doesn't apply here because it's a medical procedure. Now, Rabbi Feinstein, so that's Rashi. Comments Rabbi Feinstein. Upashit, it's obvious. She'ena kavana. Rashi's intent is not anything that I don't care happened to me. Rashi I'm allowed to do to someone else. Even if it's not to the other person's benefit. For example, one who wants to fast and take on, self-negation. Right? Or the person wants to hit himself, God forbid. You cannot do that to your friend. Even according to the opinion which says you're allowed to hit yourself, which we don't rule that way, we rule that you're not allowed to inflict a wound upon yourself. But even if you were of the view that you're allowed to wound yourself, so this person says, I like to wound myself. Okay, so now I'm allowed to go wound other people? Obviously not. Not just when it comes to wounding someone. Someone who doesn't care about his personal dignity and doesn't mind being embarrassed. Not simply because he's fulfilling the words of the Mishnah in chapter 4 of Avos. That Rabbi Levitas, the man of Yavna, Omer said, a person should be exceedingly humble or lowly. Ayin Sham, see there, the Pirush Mishnayis La Rambam, in the Rambam's commentary to that Mishnah, with respect to a certain person, so who was exceedingly humble. So never mind someone who says, I want to fulfill the Mishnah which says that I want to be humble. But moreover, and by nature, he's the kind of guy who doesn't care. These things don't bother him. Someone says not a nice word about him and it doesn't touch him, doesn't bother him. So a person might mistakenly think if the prohibition is not to do to someone else what you don't want to do to yourself, well, I don't care to be embarrassed, so then I can embarrass someone else. Obviously, certainly it's forbidden to embarrass someone. But on the contrary, one is obligated to honor a friend, to afford him dignity and respect. And it's one of the greatest sins is one who publicly embarrasses a friend. Malban means literally to whiten his face, meaning he's so embarrassed the person's blood is drained from his face. And this follows the prohibition not to bear someone else's sin. And if the person embarrasses in public, this is true even privately to embarrass someone. But if published, then it's Torah says that he's punished, that he doesn't get a share in the world. As the Rambam rules in Perek Vav Hilchos Deis Halacha Ches in chapter 6 of the Laws of Deis. Sha'alav, that the prohibition to embarrass a friend who is even when the person is not in public. So it's
means embarrass.
Yeah, lachlan means to embarrass.
What's the root to that?
Like kiloyon, I think.
Kiloyon?
I think so. Like to finish. I think lachlan means
finish the person.
Yeah.
Kiloyon.
I think that's the root word. So the prohibition to embarrass someone, says Rambam, is even if it's in private. And Rambam doesn't mention chiluk, any distinction. Weimar saying the shvei ruach, that someone who is by nature of a lowly character and doesn't mind being embarrassed, he's humble. Nowhere does he say, oh, because this guy likes to be embarrassed in public, he's allowed to embarrass others. It doesn't say that. When Rambam rules you're not allowed to embarrass, it's a universal rule, you can't do it. The imkain, if so, even a person who self-inflicts wounds, assuming he followed the view that said it's permissible, even though we at the end it is forbidden to do that, but say he did, certainly he's not allowed to inflict pain or wound on a friend. So what's Rashi's intention when he says that the prohibition is only not to do to the other what you don't want done to yourself? Why would Rashi say that if at the end of the day it's not the rule? Because if you want something done, if you don't mind being publicly embarrassed, you're not allowed to do it to somebody else. So why would Rashi then say that the prohibition is only not to do to someone what you don't want done to yourself? Seemingly it's nothing to do with that. So therefore, what must be Rashi's intention? Rashi's intention is that when you're doing a wound, which is to the benefit of the person who you're wounding, like drawing blood, like a bloodletting, everybody wants it done to themselves because the person loves himself and he wants himself to be healthy. So that we cannot say that it's forbidden to do that to somebody else. And you don't even need a verse to permit it. Look at that. Which is why, even when it comes to his father, when it comes to a father, where the prohibition to hit the father is not limited to hitting him when it's embarrassing, but any kind of hit to the father is not allowed. Right? We made this distinction last time. Rabbi Feinstein made this distinction between the prohibition against hitting a fellow man, which is, according to Rambam, only if one's hitting in a sense of strife or a sense of embarrassing, like in a negative way. But when it comes to a father, even if we use the example of boxing. Two people that are voluntarily are boxing, and they're doing it to make a few dollars or even to have fun, it'd be permitted to do that. in Rambam's view, because this is not in any way like embarrassing per se. It's part of the sport. But to a parent, you wouldn't be allowed to, because the prohibition to hit a parent is beyond the scope of just embarrassing the person you're hitting. The Gamleker Kral Lifter L'Rafua, Nami EF Shaleser, and even for a father where the prohibition to hit the person is even greater, even there, one doesn't necessarily need the verse to tell him that he's allowed to bloodlet for his father because there's a gain to be had. As far as the verse goes, so a person could bloodlet for his father, yes. So all this is to demonstrate that if there's a gain to be had through the wound, then it's permitted, and thus this woman can do her plastic surgery, essentially. Okay, let's go to the next page.
You should have seen the video of the Dr. Zelix, and that's who you should have played for the class.
Oh, it's a fucking video.
He was playing straight when you were away. Amazing. You're having to use Dr. Zelix just as a channel.
The Alter Rebbe had a doctor of Avram, and they've also had a doctor of Avram. Yeah.
Oh,
the Alter Rebbe had a doctor of Avram the Reife, Avram the healer, and the Rebbe also had Zelix's name was Avram. Anyway, okay, so let's look at the source sheet here, page 4. We'll see two Mishnahs, and the point is the comparison. So I'm going to read both Mishnahs, and Rabbi Feinstein is going to point something out in the comparison between the two Mishnahs. A priest, talking about a kohen, and we're talking about the laws of a blemish that disqualifies a kohen from serving in the temple. Right? Those who serve in the temple have to be of perfect health and of perfect beauty and symmetry, and blemishes of a certain list would render the kohen capable of serving in the temple.
These days that wouldn't fly. I always think about that when it comes to kohen. It would not fly in this day and age.
You're probably right, but as I is. Okay, so a kohen whose fingers or toes are configured one upon the other, or whose fingers or toes are attached, is likewise disqualified. But if they were attached from above the palm of the hand, or the bottom of the foot, only until the middle joint, then he is fit to work in the temple. If they were attached below the joint, higher up on the finger or toe, meaning it's past the joint, and he cut to separate them, he is fit. In a case where there was an extra finger or toe on his hand or foot and he cut it, the person had 6 fingers, something like that. If that extra appendage contains a bone, then the kohen is disqualified even after it was cut. And if there is no bone, then it's considered like extra just flesh. And if he cuts it off, then the kohen is fit. Okay, this is Mishnah number 1. Now let's go to the next Mishnah, which is written actually a number of pages earlier. Mishnah reads, with regards to one who purchases the fetus of a donkey that belongs to a Gentile. So we're referring to the laws of the firstborn donkey, which is, it's unique to the only non-kosher animal that has this law. The firstborn is to be redeemed from the kohen. You give the kohen a certain amount of money and then you take your donkey, or it's got to be actually decapitated. The donkey is decapitated if you don't do that. Okay, so the donkey's got to belong to the Jew who's obligated in this mitzvah. Otherwise, no mitzvah is expected of him. So, the Mishnah discusses the following law. With regard to one who purchases the fetus of a donkey that belongs to a Gentile, let's just assume that this is now a firstborn fetus, and one who sells the fetus of his donkey to a Gentile. So in the first case, he doesn't own the mother, he owns the fetus. In the second case, he owns the mother but doesn't own the fetus, right? Because he sold the fetus. So although he is not permitted to sell a large animal to a Gentile, and one who enters into a Sorry? Why is it written like that? I'm trying to figure out what that means. The point is, okay, let's see. He reads the next case. Okay, although he's not permitted to do that, that case, and one who enters into a partnership with a Gentile in ownership of a donkey or its fetus. So now it doesn't just belong to a Jew, it belongs in partnership. And one who receives a donkey from a Gentile in order to take for it in exchange for partnership in its offspring. So he bought the animal with the intent that they're going to own 50% of the fetus, of the offspring, and one who gives his donkey to a Gentile in receivership, meaning he gives it to him that the other guy should work it and he pays him a certain amount. In all these cases, the donkeys are exempt from the obligation of the firstborn, i.e., they did not have firstborn status and are not redeemed. As I stated, I sanctified to me all the firstborn in Israel, both man and animal, indicating that the mitzvah is incumbent upon Jewish people, but not upon others. If the firstborn belongs even partially to a Gentile, it does not have the firstborn status. What we're pointing out here, here's the main point we're pointing out. In the first Mishnah, when the Mishnah discusses the Kohen who cut off an extra finger, the Mishnah says if he cut it off, then he's allowed to work in the temple. It doesn't say he shouldn't do it, but if he did, he's allowed to be in the temple. It just says if he did it, he's in the temple. When it comes to the question of the fetus, he says, you shouldn't sell off the fetus to the guy, to the non-Jew, because that would make you no longer obligated in the mitzvah. But if you did it, okay, you're not obligated. So from the fact that the Mishnah does not use that language when it comes to cutting the extra finger, means you're allowed to. Otherwise, the Mishnah would say, although the Kohen shouldn't cut off that extra finger, if he did, he works in the temple. It doesn't say that. It just says straight up, if it's cut off, you're allowed to.
That means you're allowed to damage.
Which means, if there's a gain to be had, removing an extra finger, which is unsightly, it's permitted. This is Rabbi Feinstein's proof. Let's see. The Ksas Raya, the last paragraph there in Rabbi Feinstein's writing, so it's page Sadik Beis, the very last paragraph of Rabbi Feinstein's Teshuva. The Ksas Raya, a kind of proof to my contention here, that if there's gain to be had in the wound, then you're allowed to inflict that wound. So Yesh Oid Lahavi, we can bring a proof, B'B'Chayres Daf Mem Amud Aleph, from the Mishnah in B'Chayres, page 45a, which we just read. Shetnan, we learned, Hoysa Bo Yiseda, if the Kohen had an extra finger, V'Chotcha, and he cut it off. And the Mishnah goes on to say he's allowed to serve in the temple. V'Imaya Asa L'Chaytcha, if it was forbidden to cut it off because you're not allowed to wound yourself, Havalei Lemisne, the Mishnah should have read, Af Pishin Rashai. It should have said, even though you shouldn't do that, if you did, you're allowed to. It doesn't. It just says, if you did, you're allowed, you can work in the temple. But if there's a prohibition, it should preface it by saying, although you weren't supposed to cut that finger off, if you did, you're allowed to you can go to the temple. But it doesn't begin with that preface. It just says straight, if you cut that finger, you can work in the temple. And this language, that even though it's not allowed, but if you did, you get away with something, is employed elsewhere in the Mishnah, as we read earlier. As we see in the first Mishnah of chapter 1 and chapter 2, which we read, for one who sells his donkey or his cow to a non-Jew, Shetnan, over there the Mishnah learns, the Mishnah writes, even though you shouldn't have done that, but if you did, you're exempt from the law of B'chor of the firstborn. But V'hacha, when it comes to cutting off that extra finger, Lo Nakat, the Mishnah doesn't use that language, that really you shouldn't have done it, but if you did, the Kohen can go to the temple. So mashma, the implication is, Shirasa, it's straight out permitted to cut that extra finger. Okay, so let's stop over here, and this is the main point of Rabbi Feinstein's position, that as long as there's a gain to be had, one may indeed inflict wound upon oneself, and thus one is allowed to perform cosmetic surgery, even if there's absolutely no medical gain, if there's just the gain of enjoying your life a little better, looking a little better. In the case of the specific case that was presented to him, was a girl who wanted to get married, and she felt that if she looked a little better, she would have, her prospects would go up, and so Rabbi Feinstein says, go ahead, gesund hate. I do wonder, Rabbi Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, which wrote that he shouldn't, and his argument was because of the limitations on what doctors are and are not allowed to do. I wonder what he would say in this case. The reason why I'm saying that is because, as you remember, the language with which the Tzitz Eliezer forbade it was he was knocking a culture. Stop running off, and just because your neighbor's doing it, you also have to do it. God made your body, God made it beautiful, accept it the way it is. Right? If he's speaking to a culture, then I could see room to say that if someone is doing it not for culture, but for a specific reason, she wants to get married, then I wonder if he would say that okay, this person's not running along with the culture, there's a gain to be had, even if it's not medical, because Rabbi Waldenberg came from the perspective of the limitations on doctors. I could see that being argued. Or on the other hand, I could argue, no, there's a limitation on what doctors are allowed to do, and if it's not medical, doctors not allowed to do the procedure, finished. So I'm a little bit on the fence on where Rabbi Waldenberg would stand in the case of a girl who's looking for a shidduch, even though Rabbi Feinstein's taking it beyond the case of the shidduch. He's saying if you're gaining, then knock yourself out. No, Rabbi Feinstein's coming from the perspective of you can do whatever you want with your body, so long as it's not prohibited.
Well, the prohibition is depending on what you decide is prohibited.
Exactly. Exactly the point. Well, there are God forbid people who suffer to the point where they inflict pain upon themselves just for the sake of inflicting pain, and that's a straight up prohibition. Okay, they need to get medical attention or whatever it is that they need to do, right? But this is a woman who's a good girl and she wants to get married. She wants to.
They would have to question her. According to him, they'd probably have to interrogate her. What's your reasons why?
Right.
Culture, he would say yes.
So maybe Rabbi Waldenberg. Right. That's what I'm saying. So I'm on the fence of where Rabbi Waldenberg would stand. Rabbi Feinstein's obviously going broader than just a girl. He's saying if you have something to be gained, you're looking better at the end of it. So go enjoy Gesundheit, make yourself look better. Rabbi Waldenberg, maybe if there is a permissibility from the Tzitz Eliezer, it would only be because he's making an exception for a girl who has a reason and not just running off with the culture. Maybe. Or I could say, look, Rabbi Waldenberg is straight. If a doctor's not allowed to do it, he's not allowed to do it. So I'm a little bit on the fence of where he would stand. But let's now look at the Alter Rebbe.
Yeah, but he said because of the culture, there was a reason why.
Right, but he also started off by saying that he remember he quoted the guy who said that you're not allowed to do fertility treatment if you were born that way, because it's beyond the permission of what doctors were given by Torah. And the end of Tzitz Eliezer said that that's not the point of Torah. Certainly that constitutes as a medical procedure, and women should get fertility treatment, right? He encouraged that. But he said at the end of the day, this idea that there's a limitation on what doctors may and may not do is still true. And therefore, if there's no medical gain, doctors know how to do it. So maybe if you come from that direction, maybe we'd say he would also say it's forbidden even for the girl who wants to get married. I'm not sure where Rabbi Waldenberg would stand. I could see it both ways. I'm just saying, I don't know. But certainly Rabbi Feinstein's permissive, even more permissive than just a girl. He's saying, Michal, if you're gaining out of it, you're looking better, okay, good. Go knock Gesundheit. Okay, so let's see now the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. We're on page 5 here of the source sheet. This line in the Alter Rebbe is a gewaltige line. It's a wonderful line. Now, in the order of how I put it here, first I put the Alter Rebbe, and then I put the comment from the Rebbe, and then I put the comment from Rabbi Zevin discussing the story of Shylock. But I'm going to do it out of order. I'm going to start with the Alter Rebbe, then go to Rabbi Zevin Shylock, and then go to the Rebbe. Because I think the Rebbe has a nuance that's a step beyond Rabbi Zevin's reading of the Alter Rebbe, which is the straight reading of the Alter Rebbe. Okay, so the Alter Rebbe writes like this. This is in the laws of Niskei Aguf, laws of personal damage. I think that's the way you say it, right? Personal damage refers to like damage on the body, not property damage. Personal damage of the person. Person as in personhood. Isn't that how you say it?
No, because personal damage usually.
Personal damage could also mean my property.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean like what would you describe it when you talk about personal injury maybe? Injury? I don't know. Anyway, wounding one's body. Damages to the body. And there he says like this. It's a beautiful way of framing this halacha. It is forbidden for one to hit his fellow man. Even if my friend gave me permission to hit him. Still prohibited. Why? And this is the key word here. Ki ein la'adam reshus al gufay klal. Person does not have autonomy on his own body. La kaisai, to hit it, v'lo l'baishay, not to embarrass it, v'lo l'tzara, not to inflict pain upon it, b'shum tzara, with any pain. It's not your body. Afilu b'meniyas eza meichel in Mishnah, even to refrain from eating or drinking. Even that one's not allowed to do to themselves, because it's not your body. It's granted on loan. Doesn't say these words, but that's what it seems like. It's granted on loan. We're going to see from the Rebbe's line, he does articulate that. But it's granted on loan from Hashem. And God gives you a body. It belongs to Him. And you're entrusted to take care of it. It's not yours to decide what to do with it. LMK, the only time you're allowed to hold yourself back, refrain from eating or drinking, is in oised derech b'derech teshuva. If a person is doing it in part of his teshuva, part of his repentance.
Yourself.
Sorry?
Not just eating and drinking.
No,
to make tsar and everything.
The Alter Rebbe in Tanya writes not to do that.
I know, but
Except for fasting, he allows. Everything else, he says not to. But maybe even if it's not just fasting, because the truth is there are other works of Musar which talk about inflicting pain upon oneself for Teshuva. So let's just say it goes all the way to all kinds of pain.
So you're allowed to for Teshuva.
Yeah, if it's Teshuva, then it's allowed to. Why? Because this pain is good for him. To save his soul from the bowels of destruction. And therefore it's permitted to fast for Teshuva. Doesn't say anything else. Even one who has a hard time fasting, or even if he can't fast, but it's hard for him to fast, he's doing so for Teshuva, it's permitted. But if someone who's capable of handling a fast, it's permissible for him to fast, even if he's not doing it out of Teshuva, but because he wants to dig deeper and have a more spiritual cleansing experience, there's nothing greater than this.
So you're allowed to do it. Only fasting.
For spiritual good, it seems like. But the key here is, this is the main key, your body doesn't belong to you. That's the key, your body doesn't belong to you. Now, he's not specifically commenting on the issue of cosmetic surgery, but one could make a strong argument.
Doesn't belong to you, don't touch it.
It doesn't belong to you, don't touch it. It's if
It's not your car, don't steal it.
yes, in a way, he's taking even a step further than Rabbi Waldenberg. See, Rabbi Feinstein begins with, look, it would seem to me that the premise of Rabbi Feinstein is, your body is yours, God gave it to you. But there are prohibitions. Okay, so as long as you're not violating the prohibition, go ahead. And because you're not violating the prohibition by doing cosmetic surgery, so do cosmetic surgery. But the Alter Rebbe comes from a perspective, no, the body's not yours. In other words, is it a prohibition against hitting yourself, but otherwise do whatever you want? Or you're not allowed to do anything, but here are the few items God lets you do with your body. Which one is it? What's the premise? The body's mine, but Torah puts restrictions on it? Or is the body God's and grants me permission to do certain things with it?
According to Alter Rebbe,
So it seems to the Alter Rebbe, his body is the Eibishter's, not mine. She'ein la'adam reshus al gufay klal. The person does not have any autonomy on his body. And unless Torah says you're allowed to, unless God says you're allowed to, you don't do it. So one could make the argument that he's even going farther than Rabbi Waldenberg.
But even for medical, he wouldn't.
Because I'll tell you why, not in practice is he, because, so this is why I'm saying going further than Rabbi Waldenberg. Because Rabbi Waldenberg says like this, he's coming from the question of the healing belongs to God, and healing was granted to the doctor. God granted the doctor to be his instrument of healing. But healing belongs to God. Who does the body belong to according to Rabbi Waldenberg in Tzitz Eliezer? It doesn't comment on that. Maybe it still belongs to me. But from the Alter Rebbe, it's not that God owns healing and he granted the doctor the right to be the instrument of that healing. No. God owns healing and he owns the body upon which the healing is being performed.
Through who?
Through the doctor. So the permission is still granted, but the permission that's granted to the doctor is not only because God owns me healing, and therefore God grants permission to the doctor to be his instrument of healing, but it's even deeper. It's because God owns the body too.
So it does want you to get healed.
And that's why you need permission from Torah. We asked at the beginning, why does the language, remember we asked this, why does Torah use the language? From here, Torah gives permission for the doctor to heal. What do you mean permission? So Rabbi Waldenberg would say, permission because healing belongs to God, and God gave permission, as it were, that these people should be these instruments of his healing, and because they've been given permission, therefore they are charged with the task of being that instrument of healing. The Alter Rebbe would say even deeper. You know why you need Torah's permission for healing? Because your body is not yours. And unless the one who gave you the body, gives you permission to do something to the body, you can't do anything.
Okay, so now he gave the doctor permission.
So he gave the doctor permission. But the point is, it's coming from a permission perspective. Not like Rabbi Feinstein starts off with, the body is yours. And as long as there's no prohibition, go ahead and do it. No. The body is not yours. And you don't touch it unless you are specifically told you're allowed to. Now, this isn't definitive, even though he's certainly coming from a different angle than Rabbi Feinstein, but it's not definitive per se that this means you can't do cosmetic surgery. Because maybe this is part of the permission you're allowed. You've been granted. In other words, we can maintain that the body belongs to God, and unless he gives you permission, you can't touch it. But maybe he gave you permission to do cosmetic surgery.
Right. To look
Maybe.
better. Yeah, because to look
Maybe.
better to get his
That's
mitzvah,
right.
to get
So
married.
that's right. So exactly. Oh well, there's a question of marriage over here. Rabbi Feinstein just says, "Wow, any gain. You want to look better. You want to look more beautiful."
But the Shiloh was about the girl getting married. That was the whole main question.
Yeah.
So on that thing,
Yeah.
that's
So
the most easiest one because
Yeah.
she's only doing it to look better. No real medical.
100%. So I'm agreeing that it's not definite that the Alter Rebbe would say it's forbidden to do cosmetic surgery.
Exactly. It could look like
But
it's
it's-
most strictest, but it could be. The
That's
other way
right.
too.
That's right. It's more the perspective I'm giving here, which is
Yeah.
not the perspective of you can do what you want as long as there's no prohibition. The perspective is you can't do anything unless you've been granted allowance. Well, maybe cosmetic surgery is part of the allowance. I can't tell you. And if Rabbi Feinstein can make a good enough case, quoting all these sources, that cosmetic surgery, say the story of the guy, the Kohen cutting his finger, and it's a good enough proof that cosmetic surgery is one of those things Torah says you're allowed to, then Alter Rebbe would say, okay, so the grantor of your body says you're allowed to do this. Fine. But the perspective he's coming from is a different perspective, which is the body is not mine.
You know, so-
So with that, now let's skip the next text. The next text is the Rebbe. We'll go to the Rebbe at the end, because the Rebbe's going to add a nuance. And let's read L'Oyer HaHalacha. Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin. So I mentioned in my note that Rabbi Zevin is a Chabad chassid, but not necessarily a Lubavitcher chassid. I was hoping that when I wrote that, someone would say, hey, what does that mean?
Yeah.
We know this from Chaim.
What?
Try it.
That what?
Because he doesn't write in his book a story about the Rebbe. There's one or two.
No, because it's true, but
He
I'll tell you
doesn't
why.
like that book.
Because in Russia, the Rebbe encouraged him a lot to write this. Anyway, the Rebbe encouraged him a lot. He had a very extensive...
What that's the name.
Okay, I'll explain in a moment, yeah. Rabbi Zevin was very much strongly, he actually encouraged the Rebbe to become Rebbe, and he was very strongly encouraged by the Rebbe to publish the Encyclopedia Talmudis. They had extensive letters back and forth between the Rebbe and him. Now, why I said he's Chabad, but not necessarily Lubavitch, because in Russia, pre-war, Chabad meant that you followed the Alter Rebbe's philosophy, and that you were following Chassidus in the way of the Alter Rebbe Chabad, rather than the Polish, which was more the Chagas Chassidim they were called, the emotional Chassidim. But it wasn't necessarily Lubavitch because there were breakaways. The Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, had 5 sons, all of whom became Rebbes. One of them became Rebbe in Chernobyl dynasty, but 4 of them became Chabad Rebbes, but not Lubavitch. So you had in Russia pre-war, you had Chabad Lubavitch, the Marash, you had Chabad Kapust, the Maril, you had Chabad Liadi, which was Chaim Shner Zalman, and you had Chabad Niezhin, which was Bisol Noyach. That was his name? Bisol Noyach. So, sorry?
Yeah, there was one. So
Yeah,
why
so
is that said like that?
Why is the history is interesting? Tzemach Tzedek had, because the bottom line, Tzemach Tzedek encouraged his sons to teach Chassidus even while he was still alive. They were teaching Chassidus.
He gave them most of it. They should answer questions.
They should answer questions. Yeah. They were involved already before. Now Lubavitch was actually the smallest of them all before the war, for a long time. So Rabbi Zevin was a Chabad Chassid, but not a Lubavitch one. Like the Rogachover probably also was very similar, probably the similar thing. Like many. Anyway, so Rabbi Zevin at the end of the day was Chabad, but not necessarily Lubavitch in that sense. So he had a very close relationship with the Rebbe, but
You identified the city or your philosophy?
Lubavitch identified with their Marash and his succession, the succession that stayed in Lubavitch. There were nuances, there were and are differences between the philosophies of these various different strains, but they all follow the Chabad in the broad sense that their Chassidus was deep and elaborate and highly intellectually stimulating, as opposed to the short snippets of inspirational lines that come from the Polish Chassidus, the
Give
Polish.
us one example. What was the difference between Sol Noyach?
Between-
Lubavitch, what was the difference?
Okay, so let's say Kapust, there were more external,
So more like
external, not exactly, because he gave very deep Torah also. But the Rebbe Marash was very no external visuals of piety. No one should see anything that's going on. Same thing with the Mittler Rebbe and the Stasheller. Anyway, the Chaim Shner Zalman, his Torah is a little bit shorter than the other brothers. Different styles. Nice. Anyway, so Rabbi Zevin was a Chabad Chassid, but had a very close relationship with the Rebbe. He wrote a book called L'Oyer HaHalacha, which is a very wonderful book, and it's a halachic book, but not halachic in the sense of like do, don't. It's more like halachic analysis of situations. So he gives a halachic analysis of various different holidays. For example, goes through all the Yom Tovim, gives like the halachic, not the halachas that you don't, but the halachic background and analysis of the Yom Tov. It's a very interesting book. So at the end, he has an essay on what would be the halachic ruling of the case of Shylock. The case of Shylock, of course, is from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. It's an anti-Semitic book, basically. It's an anti-Semitic story about a Jew, the merchant, the moneylender, the Jewish moneylender, who lends money out to a guy named Antoninus, something like that. Antonio. Yeah, lends money to a non-Jew.
Right, so.
And he has him sign a contract that if you don't pay by X date, I'm going to collect a pound of your flesh.
Yeah.
And at the end, the guy can't pay back, and the greedy Jew is demanding his pound of flesh. It's an anti-Semitic book where the Jew is so greedy he wants his pound of flesh, meaning cut off a pound of his. Of course, the story is made up. It's a novel. It's a Shakespearean play, but it's an anti-Semitic play. So Shylock is the name of the Jew. So Rabbi Zevin goes through a whole essay. What would be the halacha if such a contract was presented before the court? So obviously you can't take the pound of flesh. But what happens with the loan? Is the loan a valid loan or an invalid loan? Because the condition. Sorry? Yeah. So he goes through a whole discussion on what is the prohibition against inflicting wound upon yourself, because this is a person who signed away a pound of his own flesh. Right? So and there he gets to, and now he gets to the Alter Rebbe. He quotes this line from the Alter Rebbe. So let's see.
Yeah, but that's a guy's body. It's different ballgame.
If it was two Jews, you think hypothetically,
Jews, yes.
If it was two Jews, what would be the halachic court? So he quotes the Alter Rebbe like this. It's a beautiful piece. He goes back and forth and back and forth. And then he goes, it's a very nice essay. Now he just writes very beautifully, so I'm going to read it and try to translate it. I'll try to translate it as much as I can without commentary, just because his translation is so beautiful. His writing is very beautiful. So bottom of page 5. The power of life in the body of man, it doesn't belong to him. Shala Adam, of this man. Zui hanakuda, this is the main point. Not only is it forbidden for one to take his own life, kulam, the entirety of his life, or part of his life, meaning to make himself unhealthy. That life isn't his at all, meaning it's not like it's your life, but you're forbidden to do something with it. It's not your life to begin with. If someone sells, gives, or puts on loan some flesh, the flesh of his body, so that it can be cut off to anybody, it's as if he is selling something that doesn't belong to him. Where this sale does not take place. If I sold you my neighbor's house, they don't have to go through the courts to get the money back to you. The sale never happened. So till this point he was arguing that maybe the loan still stands, but you don't go through with the cutting of the flesh because you're not allowed to. Now he's saying because the body is not yours, the loan never happened. Because you loaned something that wasn't yours. And he quotes the verse, Hashem nasa and Hashem lakach, God takes, God gives. It's not just a comforting statement, God gives and God takes. A comforting statement you say at funerals, God takes and God gives. No. It's a description of the reality. God granted life to man that he should use them. But it's not been given to him in such a way that the person does whatever he wants with it. Taking life back is only permissible to the one who gave it, like Kadosh Baruch Hu to God, not to the person himself. He is not autonomous, but in this sense, al atzma himself. No bodily autonomy in Torah. So sorry?
Going back after 6, to an
that's what the Torah says. The reason why you notice,
you can't do it.
That's why you weren't allowed to.
It just gets to
Which, by the way, that's why it's not kinyan. When it comes to an evet, it's not kinyan aguf. At least the evet ivri. For that reason, because Torah says, "What are you selling yourself out? You don't belong to the other guy. You belong to me." Right. So continues Rabbi Zevin. What's the halachic foundation for this principle that life is not mine? I've been made known at first to this foundation, this idea, this principle, L'shoni Shalad Murazakin, the words of the Alter Rebbe, Balatanya, the author of the Tanya, B'Shulchan Aruch Shaloi, in his code. Sha'adam Asar Lit Ba'atzmai, it is forbidden for someone to wound oneself. This, says Rabbi Eliezer, Mavor B'Mishnah, Gemara, Poskim. It's already stated in the Mishnah, the Gemara, all the halachic rulers, everybody agrees you're not allowed to inflict wound upon yourself. But as opposed to all the other sources, Kosov, it reads, She'ein Rashai, it is inappropriate to hurt yourself. Oy Asr, it's forbidden. Hine Nisach Harav, here is the language of the Rabbi, the Alter Rebbe. Dinzeh, this is how he frames this law, the prohibition to hit yourself. But Lashon Zeh in the following words. Asr lahakais es chaver, it is forbidden for one to hit his fellow. Afilu noisim lerishos, even if the other person gave him permission. Lakaisai, to hit him. Ki ein la'adam rishos al gufay klal. A person's body is not in his own possession. Lakaisai, to allow it to be hit. So Hivliya Harab ben Ima, the rabbi very pleasantly snuck in, derech agav, as if by the way, nekud nefla, a wonderful foundation. Ein la'adam rishos al gufay klal. A person does not have autonomy on his own body at all.
Says it's perfect. The wording.
He writes it so well, this Rabbi Zevin.
Excellent.
It's everybody else says it's forbidden. It's not appropriate. Alter Rebbe doesn't say it's forbidden. He says it's not yours.
Yeah, clear.
It's beautiful. Ube'emes, and the truth is, af ikar din shel harav. This the foundation of the Rav's law, the Alter Rebbe's law, she'isur lahakas es chaveroi, that the prohibition to hit somebody else, who gam ba'ofen kisha chaveroi noisin l'reshus lakach, is even when the friend gives him permission to hit him. Ikar din zeh ein mavor lo b'sugas hagemara lo Poskim. This idea that you're not allowed to hit someone when he gives you permission is not straight up written in the halachic rulings that precede the Alter Rebbe. It's the Alter Rebbe's nuance because he says your body's not yours, right? But that idea that you're not allowed to hit someone even if you give permission, says Rabbi Zevin, is not to be found in earlier halachic rulings. Mashim before the Mishnah, that which the Mishnah does say, someone who says, blind me, amanas lifter, and you won't be liable. So the Mishnah says, chayev, you are liable if you blind him. So says the Rabbi Zevin, Eina inyan lezeh. This is not a proof to the point that you're not allowed to hit someone if you're given permission. Kishama nidun, because over there the question is al chiv tashlumin. The question is, are you obligated to pay back? V'loya isra hapula. The Mishnah there does not discuss whether the actual act is forbidden or not. So the Mishnah just says, if I tell someone blind me, and don't worry, you won't have to pay, you'll still have to pay. You're still chayiv, but it doesn't say. It's not discussing whether it's permitted or forbidden for him to do that. Adam, on the contrary. If this is your proof, in the Gemara and the various different halachic rulings, it's explained because he's wholeheartedly because even when he says, don't worry, you don't have to pay, he doesn't really actually want it. But when it comes to wounding someone in which there's no bodily damage, if he says, hit me in the arm and I won't charge you for it, you're actually exempt from paying.
Rosh Ivar maybe means main Ivar, no?
Rosh Ivar means there's no head of a limb, meaning Rash isn't like Rosh, head. Yeah.
So it means main ones, no?
No, it means I think it means there's no actual wound to the limb. I think that's what it means. And over there, it's allowed to. But when it comes to whether or not you're allowed to do that, the Rabbi, the Alter Rebbe explicitly states, no permission helps. We'll take this. Rabbi Zevin is telling us that even in a case where the halacha says that because you got permission to hit the guy, you're exempt. Even in such a case, the Alter Rebbe is telling you you're still not allowed to hit him because it's not his body to grant permission. It just so happens he doesn't have to pay him because he forgave it. But just because I forgave it, it doesn't mean you're allowed to hit me. It's not mine to forgive. I can forgive you paying me back. That I can forgive you. And when it comes to blinding me, I don't really mean it, and therefore you still have to pay. Fine. But the permission to hit me, not mine to give. This is the nuance in the Alter Rebbe. We're getting it very sharply explained by the Rabbi Zevin. One more paragraph, even though he goes on much more elaborate, but we'll do one more paragraph. We could bring a proof to the Alter Rebbe's position from the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara says, we learned this Gemara earlier. The Gemara asks the following question: Ben Ma'u Shiyakas Dam La'aviv. Is a son allowed to bloodlet his father? Upashtu Sham, and the Gemara resolves that Shelo Refuah, because the bloodletting is for the sake of medicinal purpose, mutter is permitted. Now, this is the Gemara which we learned. Says Rabbi Zevin, if any time one person grants permission to another person, you're allowed to hit the person, why is the Gemara even asking, is a son allowed to bloodlet the father? Why would the Gemara have to say, oh, you know why you're allowed? Because it's medicinal purpose. It would anyways be permissible, because he's giving permission. So why is the Gemara worried? In other words, the Gemara asks, are you allowed to bloodlet your father? And the Gemara answers, well, because it's a medicinal, therefore you're allowed to. If the father granted permission, then you don't need the reason for medicinal purpose. Must therefore be, we must therefore say that even with permission, it's still forbidden. And only because it's medicinal, that's why it's allowed. So Rabbi Zevin almost sounds like there's no medicinal use to this hit, to this wound. You can't, even if you get permission. So he seems to be learning Alter Rebbe the way we suggested earlier, like the first way we suggested, that if it's not my body to give away, unless Torah says here you're allowed to, you may not.
Where does it say you're allowed to?
For medicinal purpose.
Or if the doctor decides that the girl needs it because her head will be crazy because she's not going to go
If psychological medicinal also counts.
Yes.
Psychological also counts as medicinal, but the case where there's no medicinal use, no medical value at all, it would seem from the way Rabbi Zevin's understanding Alter Rebbe, no. Yeah.
Girl would not be part of
It would seem. She's feeling bad.
Okay, so if it's a question of psychological issue, maybe different, and maybe getting married is different. But if it's tam just for the sake of looking better, even though Rabbi Feinstein would say it's fine because there's a gain, and the gain outweighs the prohibition of wounding yourself, Rabbi Zevin would learn in the Alter Rebbe, no, you can't, seemingly. Now let's conclude the paragraph from Rabbi Zevin. We should not suggest that when the Gemara says that the only reason why you're allowed to bloodlet is because it's medicinal, don't say that the reason why the Gemara does that is because we're talking about father and son. But one friend to another, permission is enough. But if one were to hit another person, which is a different prohibition, remember the Torah says that when you giving someone lashes, you may not give more lashes than necessary. And that's where we derive, you're not allowed to hit your friend. Which is different than the prohibition where the Torah says explicitly, do not hit your parent. So you might say, okay, when it comes to a parent, only if it's medicinal. But when it comes to a friend, Torah listening to then permission granting might be enough. Says Rabbi Zevin, that's a misreading of the Gemara. Because the Gemara there quotes a Braisa, a Mishnaic age text from the Mechilta, which is a halachic medrash. Where the prohibition to hit one's father also comes from the same prohibition of not hitting your fellow man. When the Torah says, according to this source, thou shalt not hit thy parent, that's not actually the prohibition. That's just the description of the punishment, that there's capital punishment. But the essential prohibition to hit your parent is the same prohibition to not hit a friend. And thus, if it's only for medicinal that you're allowed to hit your parent, then likewise, it's only for medicinal you're allowed to hit your friend. And giving permission does not override the prohibition, because the body is not mine to give permission. Beautiful, beautiful words from Rabbi Zevin, highlighting one little line from the Alter Rebbe. Let's conclude now with the Rebbe's comment. So go back one page.
You're supposed to get 40, you only give him 39. Why?
We only give 39. Why? I don't remember.
Because it's 40.
Yeah, why we only give 39? Because I can't remember why we only give 39. But the Lo Yosef means you cannot give him more than what they would do is they would have a doctor on hand who would tell the Bezdin how much this person can handle, and you're not allowed to add more than that.
If he said only go after 20, you have to stop.
Stop at 20, yeah. Okay.
This is clear, it's straight.
So now let's see
The
Rebbe, page 5. Lakut Sichos, volume 34, page 106. And the Rebbe is discussing there's two principles in halacha which seem to conflict, and the Rebbe is trying to explain why they don't conflict. And the Rebbe cites to this Alter Rebbe to explain why they don't conflict. And the two principles are as follows. One principle is, you can see I wrote it there in the bold, Haydah es baldin k'meir edom. The admission of the litigant is as worthy as 100 witnesses. So when it comes to monetary issues, I demand that someone owes me $500. The guy comes to court and says, I agree, yes, I do owe you $500. That's worth 1,000 witnesses. I don't need any more witnesses. The guy agreed that he owes the money. Good. But then there's another principle, which is, Ein adam meitzam asmei rasha. A person cannot say about himself that he's wicked. So a person can't come to court and say, well, I did X, Y, Z. We disregard what he says. So what is it? Do we take his word, don't take his word? And the difference essentially comes down to, is it an issue of monetary value, or is it a question of my own self?
Yes, how do you do that? Well,
When it comes to my own self, say, I did X.
Well, you're Russia. You stole it.
Well,
Making Russia different.
get to look at the sikhs. I think he's talking about
Two different things.
it's a person who says I did a certain sin.
Sinning is one thing, but
Right. So the question is, if we believe him always, because it's worth 1,000 meaning, this is, let's just pull up the page for a second. 1 second. Page Lamed page 106.
Yeah.
Right. When it comes to Malchus, so say a person says I ate something. If a person comes and says I ate X, Y, Z, he's not administered lashes. We don't give him lashes. But two witnesses come and say he did it, then he does get lashes. So what happened? Doesn't my own testimony count as 1,000 witnesses? How come I'm not given lashes? Right? So when it comes to monetary issues, I acknowledge that I owe X amount of money. Like 1,000 witnesses, I pay up. But if it comes to an issue of where I might get lashes, no, we're not listening to you because a person cannot make himself into a wicked person, and your testimony we disregard. So what's going on?
oh, because the body may be hitting now.
Because your body's not yours to give testimony about. That's right. So let's see.
Wait a minute, if he admits to, God forbid, somebody comes over and says,
If
"I'm
they have to
guilty,"
kill him,
So they know he wouldn't get capital punishment if he admitted to his guilt. There are other things, but not that.
No, but if he comes to court and he says, I'm guilty, then he's guilty.
He doesn't necessarily get the sentence. There's other sentences. So let's see. So now that we're read like this, in explaining this, we can explain as follows, says the Rebbe. On page 5, in the left-hand column there. The right-hand column is a footnote, which we'll see in a moment. In the middle of the page, page 5,
top to right, the top three.
left column, yeah.
Yeah, base.
The explanation is, Nafshay v'chayei shel Adam, the life and soul of man, Nimsru ma'kadosh Baruch Hu was granted from God, la Adam to the person, Rak besor pikadon, only as a pikadon means like to be held in your custody. Like if I give you an object, please, like collateral is a mashkin.
That's right.
Pikadon is I just ask you to hold something for me.
Right.
Please watch this for me. And this is what God's doing with your life and body. Could you please hold on to this for X amount of time? V'loy l'ba'al shaloi. It's not his. The body's not his. His life is not his. Ukipsak Rabbeinu Azakim b'shulchanai. As the Alter Rebbe rules in his Shulchan Aruch, quoting the same passage we read earlier, the ein la'adam rishus al gufay klal la'kaisachulu. Person's body is not his. He has no autonomy on his body.
What for Shem Mizach, Shem Mechina? It's different things.
So what kind of shemer are you?
But then you could say you're chayiv in different things. It depends what you say by a shemer with Pekadin.
Yeah. So what kind of shemer? I don't know.
So then you are. It's not like.
What kind of shemer are you? Don't know. But it's still not yours. So then,
But you have some obligations, and maybe you could.
You still don't own it, even if you're a shemer sacher
You're
and
allowed to do certain things. So maybe you would be.
only to take care of it.
Uh-huh.
Only to
So
take care of it, right?
to get to-
So take care of your body. Yes, you have to.
To look better.
Yeah. Oh,
That's what I'm trying to say.
maybe. I hear you. Let's see. Now, Alpiza, based on this, says the Rebbe, the fact that a person is forewarned against damaging his own body, the Rebbe adds a nuance here. So Rabbi Zevin's nuance was, your body is not yours. What did Rabbi Zevin add? He said your body is not yours it belongs to Hashem. What did he say? Right, it's not mine to get, it's not mine to lend out, to loan, to sell, or anything like that.
He just did the
Now he's saying like this. The prohibition against, so now they was adding like this. What's the prohibition? There are different types there's a different types of prohibition, right? There's different dinim.
There's no Isser. They didn't bring the whole Isser thing. The Alter Rebbe was just, it's not yours.
Oh, that's right. What's that? No, he's saying it's not Isser. Ain't like initial Isser. It's not just an Isser. Let's see. Well, let's see. So Rabbi Zevin said it's not that it's yours, but you're not allowed to. It's not yours to begin with. Okay, that's what Rabbi Zevin said.
Right.
Now the Rebbe is saying like this: the fact that Torah says you're not allowed to hit yourself is not a din in the categories of Isurim. Isurim means there's different types of prohibitions, right? There's the laws of prohibition. You're not allowed to eat this. You're not allowed to do this on Shabbos. You're not allowed to mix milk and meat. You're not allowed to weave wool and linen, and all kinds of prohibitions. Those are the class of Isurim. Then there is Dinei Kinyanim, the din of acquisition. The laws of acquisition. Do I acquire something or not acquire something? And it's a whole set of laws. What's the moment at which I acquire something? How exactly do I sell something? At what moment does the transference of ownership go from me to you? So now the prohibition against hitting myself, against self-inflicting pain, does that fall into the class of don't eat non-kosher? Or does it fall in the class of this doesn't belong to you, don't touch it? Which category of prohibition is it? Says the Rebbe, based on Alter Rebbe, it's in the issue of kinanim. It's from the laws of acquisition. The body is not yours. He has no permission, he has no ownership al gufa in his body. Because the body is the acquisition, the property of God. It's only being it's only in my custody, but it's not my body.
It's doing more. The Rebbe says not only it's not the Isser, but there really is there, but it's also.
That's right.
Zevin did not all bring in the Isser.
You're saying that you're saying they're saying both. They're saying first of all it's an Isser.
It is an Isser.
It's an Isser. In addition to the Isser, it's also not yours.
Exactly.
Maybe.
That's what I see it as.
Oh, maybe you're right. Let's see the footnote.
We should have just learned this.
Yeah. Let's look at the footnote.
We would appreciate this if we didn't learn all
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You don't appreciate it unless you. Yeah. You see the clarity of it without going through all the.
This is straight clarity.
So 12. The Lechura says the Rebbe, what's the proof what's the proof from the language of the Alter Rebbe that the prohibition against inflicting wound upon oneself is not just a prohibition, but it's a question of property acquisition and who does it belong to? What's the proof? The Lechura, because seemingly Havalei Lameima Bekitzer. The Alter Rebbe could have written very briefly, footnote 12 on the right hand column there. Havalei Lameima Bekitzer. The Alter Rebbe could have wrote more briefly. It's forbidden for a person to hit oneself, which is what he says. He said at the beginning, you can't hit your friend, even if he gave you permission. He could have said, why can't my friend hit me if I give him permission? Because I can't hit myself. That's not what he says. And from the length of his language, not from the elongated language, the person has no right to his body at all. It's clear. It's because he has no ownership and he has no permission or ownership on his body. Not simply that he's prohibited from hurting it, but he doesn't own it to begin with. So it would seem that the Rebbe and Rabbi Zevin are in agreement here in understanding the Alter Rebbe that a person does not own his body, and if that's the case, you would have to find. I can't say for sure that the Rebbe would say it's forbidden to do cosmetic surgery, or that Rabbi Zevin would say it's forbidden to do cosmetic surgery. I cannot say that. But one thing is certain. You'd have to find very strong grounds to say it's permitted. Where's Rabbi Zevin? Where's Rabbi Feinstein? All he does is he looks for prohibition, and as long as the prohibition doesn't apply, permitted. But for the Rebbe, it's not a question of prohibition and permissibility. It's a question of ownership. And at the end of the day, you don't own your body. So unless you can prove that God specifically, the one who actually owns the body, says you may do X, you seemingly should not be able to. So I cannot say for sure that it's forbidden to do cosmetic surgery from the Rebbe's perspective. I can't say that for sure, but it would certainly require a lot of proof to prove that God is actually granting permission to do this with the body.
fact that the Abishter gave permission to the doctor in there itself is that leniency that if in your brain, I would see that the Rebbe will let you do it.
So it's
even that all of this, I would see yes.
Yeah,
anything to get a yid to feel good, safe-wise, no problem.
Yeah. So look,
I have no problem with the Rebbe saying.
I'll tell you. Let's think of it this way.
The highest goes to the lowest.
I'll just to prove to your point, just to add to your argument. Even though Torah says that the Alter is writing, the body's not yours, but a person's allowed to get earrings. So a woman can get earrings, nose rings, right? So why are they allowed to do that?
Beautiful.
So we'll have to argue that this is one of those things Torah says you're allowed to. And what's the proof? Because we have all kinds of stories in the Gemara, in the Torah, where gifts of Yaakov gives, Eliezer gives Rivka gifts of nose rings and earrings. So we have such things, right? And the nose ring and the earrings were used for the Beis Mikdash, right? So we can see then therefore, that Torah grants permission for that, right? Unless you want to argue it doesn't count, that doesn't constitute as inflicting a wound upon yourself. But why is that different than cosmetic surgery? You have to explain to me.
A hole in your ear, come on. Sometimes
But the principle of it. No, I'm asking. I'm proving your point.
Rabbi Waldenberg, he's not going for this. It could be culture. Forget it.
So Rabbi Waldenberg would say you're not allowed to have earrings
Sure
and
not. People all the
earrings.
do it.
Can't have earrings. Torah has people have earrings in Torah. Earrings and nose rings exist in Torah. It would be hard for me to say that the Tzitz Eliezer says it's forbidden. So so you have to define so what defines the line where you're allowed to have. See,
you should have told us this in the beginning. This
if
is
we're
a perfect case.
If we're going to follow the Rebbe's argument that the body and the Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe that the body doesn't belong to you, so why are you allowed to have earrings and nose rings? And where's the line between that and cosmetic surgery? Which is further to your point. Maybe Taka, even if we don't take Rabbi Feinstein's angle, that as long as it's forbidden, as long as it's permissible, you're allowed to. And we'll take out the Rebbe's angle that the body doesn't belong to you. But Torah gave permission to beautify your body, right? You have to come from that way, and maybe there's room to say that. I'm not making a halachic ruling. I'm just saying you'd really have to prove. I don't know.
You are proving the Torah is you're allowed to beautify your body. Why are you wearing these rings? So you have proof.
But right, but at the same time.
You just threw a wrench into the whole thing.
Yeah, a little bit. I'm saying.
Big time.
I'm saying.
Proof from the Torah, clearly you're allowed to make a hole in your body to beautify it.
Unless jewelry is different, I don't know. Unless the jewelry is different, I don't know. Unless jewelry is different.
Why? Yeah, I'm sure
I don't know. You have to find a line somewhere.
Yeah, you know why? No, he gave the
making a hole in the ear, making a hole in the nose, in a completely innocuous place.
No.
Why is that different than cosmetic surgery?
No, with the slave when he had to leave and he didn't want to leave. So
Okay, so there clearly Torah's overriding. Torah's the same God which gave you the body is the one that says do this to the ear if the slave overstays his welcome, right? So there's Torah saying you're allowed to, which is the same thing with a bris, by the way. A bris milah also you're inflicting a wound on the body, but Torah says to do that. And by the way, just if you want to add if you want to throw a wrench into that, also we'll throw another wrench in. We all know the line Tikkun Olam, right? You've heard this line before, yeah? Where does it come from? It comes from a medrash. The medrash is that Rabbi Yeshua was discussing with a Greek philosopher, and the Greeks, of course, worshipped the body, right? The body was like, they would play sports in the nude because the body is the most beautiful thing ever, and there were even Jews. The Mishnah refers to this. Hamefer Lasai. They would do this bizarre kind of surgery where they would reverse the bris. They would reverse the circumcision because they wanted to fit in with the Greeks going to the arenas naked. So the Rabbi Yeshua is discussing with this Greek philosopher, and the Greek philosopher tells him, "Didn't God make a perfect world? Didn't God make a perfect body? Why are you ruining it with this bris milah?" So Rabbi Yeshua said to him, "Do you eat straight stalk from the ground? No, you grind it and make it into bread, right? So you see that God created the world imperfect and tells man to perfect it. And that's what the bris is. Your body's made imperfect, the world's made imperfect, and it's man's job to perfect it. This is where the phrase Tikkun Olam comes from that medrash, to fix the world. So the fixing of the world from the medrash is even the body imperfect. Right? So obviously a bris is not the same thing as cosmetic surgery. But I'm making the point that Torah does say that you can, quote, so to speak, beautify the body. A bris is not a physical beauty, it's a spiritual beauty. But nonetheless, the point is made nonetheless. Right? And also, like, for example, Dr. writes here that why is it that you're allowed to fast even though the body's not yours? He doesn't say the reason why you're allowed to fast is because God gives permission for fasting for Teshuva? He says you're allowed to fast because it's tova. It's good for you. Good for your soul.
It's good for your soul.
Okay, so is it good for the soul, not good for the body? But the point, he should have said in theory that God says, unless that's what it means. Teshuva is a mitzvah from God, and this helps your mitzvah. That's why it's good for you. But that's not clear in the language. Meaning, even after we're stuck with the principle that the body is not yours, clearly there are ways in which Torah says you could do certain things to that body that doesn't belong to you. For example, you can fast because Teshuva is good for you, right? So I'm just putting this all out there that we should just, even as we take the Alter perspective, and the simplest way of understanding Alter perspective is that you cannot do cosmetic surgery because the body is not yours. Nonetheless, it's not, unless you see that I write this in straight up, do not do cosmetic surgery because the body is not yours. Unless you see that line, don't derive halacha from the passage we just read here, because it can be read in different kinds of ways. But the perspective is a very beautiful perspective. That, this idea is my body, my choice. No, it's not. It's not your body, it's not your choice. It's God's body and it's God's choice. And God says, ask the doctor. So ask the doctor, right? But it's not the my body, my choice. That's not a Torah attitude. It's God's body. That way of thinking remains true no matter how we slice up the halacha about cosmetic surgery. All right.
Now he gave the doctor permission to do everything.
Yeah.
He's the middle guy that can decide everything. Anyways, everything was good to you. Just bring in these last four things. It throws everything off. Clear.
Makes it fun.
Then you said they think that the bris is not perfect before, and then with the bris it is perfect.
It's Medrash. Medrash says, that Hashem made the word lases l'saken.
So then going back to that way, perfect. So a girl wants to have her face perfect to get married, so she should be able to do it.
So one can argue that way, yeah.
Perfecting. So
okay, you don't make.
And the earrings making you perfect.
We don't derive halacha from Medrash. So the Medrash is not a halachic source, but still the attitude of the Medrash that the world is made imperfect and we're to perfect it is said about the body too, even if we're not talking about it in a halachic sense. Anyway, okay.
This was the best one.
I think it's very geschmack this whole sugya.
Yeah. Should have started this.
But Nach didn't. Yeah, she started. Yeah.
No, if we said it wouldn't be as good.
Read the whole essay from Rabbi Zevin. He goes more and more about the Alter Rebbe. He keeps on quoting other Gemaras to back it up. It's beautiful.
Chaim says it because he's all the Rabbi